All right, I'd like to welcome everyone. This is our ninth town hall in our National Town Hall series, and all of our previous town halls and related resources are archived on our website, and that's the nmvvrc.org. You'll see that again later on in the slides, don't worry. So today, I'm pleased to say that we have 576 registrants with 16 people representing 6 other countries. So welcome to our international allies. The 560 US registrants represent 45 states in addition to DC, and 59% of our registrants are in communities that have actually experienced an MVI. And 60% of those who responded have professionally responded to a mass violence incident. So I'd like to welcome everyone to Trauma Across the Lifespan of Mass Violence Victims and Impacted Communities. Today, you'll learn that trauma is not just a singular response to being a victim of mass violence or living in an impacted community. There are many types of individual and collective trauma and many evidence-based strategies to mitigate the impact on victims and communities. So we're pleased to announce that our center has a new name and tagline now. We are now the National Mass Violence Center, providing resources to victims, survivors, and those who serve them. So while our name has changed, our high-quality, evidence-based resources remain, and we are making them even better every day. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. So this is the first time that we have ASL interpretation, and I am so pleased to say that this will continue in all future national town halls. In addition, our team has compiled an excellent resource page with information about trauma and effective responses and websites that can strengthen your knowledge about trauma across the lifespan. And thanks to all of you who sent in questions. You know, we have set time aside at the end to answer as many of those as possible. All right, so we have 5 ambitious learning objectives, and we are going to try to achieve those today. So I'm just going to summarize them. You know, by the end of this presentation, you should be able to describe several different types of trauma that can impact mass violence victims, survivors, and communities. And in addition, you know, you're going to be able to identify potential risks and protective factors for a broad range of reactions to trauma and what those reactions might be, including what traumatic reactions can look like across the lifespan. And importantly, we'd like everyone to be able to identify evidence-based ways to help cope with trauma and build personal resilience for those impacted by mass violence. So this is our first national town hall that features only National Mass Violence Center team members. But we're going to be augmented too by some video clips demonstrating the, quote, power of personal story of our 2 long-term advisors. I have the honor of working with our distinguished panelists of mental health providers for many years, a couple over 20 years, and I can attest to their expertise about trauma and its impact and their passion for this work. So I'm going to try to keep my introductions brief, but visit our website to get more information about our presenters. Dr. Alyssa Reingold is a licensed clinical psychologist and professor at the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center. So, and that is within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina. And she serves as the Director of Preparedness, Response, and Recovery for the National Mass Violence Center. The majority of Dr. Reingold's work has been in the area of crime victimization, but with a special emphasis on traumatic loss by homicide. So she brings an incredible wealth of information and research and clinical work related to loss and complicated bereavement. Dr. Rochelle Hansen is also a clinical psychologist and professor here at the National Crime Victims Center. Her area of research focuses on dissemination and implementation of trauma-focused evidence-based interventions. And as director of the National Mass Violence Technical and Training and Technical Assistance Division, So she's responsible for overseeing all training and technical assistance activities, including development of online courses and implementation of learning collaboratives for training mental health professionals and brokers of care in areas affected by mass violence incidents. And lastly, Dr. Angela Moreland. She's an associate professor and also a licensed clinical psychologist here at the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center. And her primary projects focus on prevention of maltreatment, as well as several other projects focused on dissemination and implementation of evidence-based trauma-focused treatments. She helps lead us here at the National Mass Violence Center in her role as associate director, and she'll be sharing her expertise on evidence-based trauma-focused treatments for children and adults, including first responders. And that's me with a pre-pandemic picture. I'm a clinical psychologist as well, and a professor at the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center. And I support efforts here at the National Mass Violence Center in my role as co-director for the Division of Training and Technical Assistance. And my work focuses primarily on improving access to care to traditionally underserved populations and tailoring interventions to ensure that they are culturally and linguistically appropriate for the communities that we serve. And I'm honored to be with you here today, and I'm really looking forward to moderating this panel of experts as they share their experience and their knowledge. But first, the National Mass Violence Center would not be what it is today without the guidance and support from our OVC Senior Program Manager, Eugenia Pedley. Eugenia is always on the front line for victims of mass violence crimes. She not only guides our team, but she inspires our daily work. We are so grateful for her leadership. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Eugenia Pedley.
Thank you so much, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you can join us for the session today. As Michael mentioned, I am Eugenia, and I manage the Mass Violence Program at OVC. For those of you who have not heard about it, in 1984, Congress established the Office for Victims of Crime under the U.S. Department of Justice through an amendment to the Victims of Crime Act known as VOCA. One element of OVC's mission is to both plan for and respond to mass violence and terrorism events. As far as today's topic goes, we know from our work in this field that mass violence in communities can have wide-ranging and long-lasting effects. The people most personally touched are those who lost loved ones and those who were injured or witnessed these tragedies. Responders are also impacted to a significant extent. Beyond this, we know there are ripple effects throughout the larger community. We expect to be safe in public settings like schools, houses of worship, shopping venues, concerts, and other places that we regularly go. And when we aren't, we often feel that impact deeply. We also know that when mass violence occurs, survivors are in different places in their lives and experiences. Some may be going through other difficulties or have a history of trauma, while others have trusted friends or relatives they can rely on for support. We also need to consider other factors like historical trauma in some communities, whether the crime is targeting a particular population, and similar dynamics. All of this and more can affect how survivors respond to an incident. What their lives were like on the day of the event may affect their healing trajectory and impact their ability to be resilient. Knowing this can help experts provide the most appropriate approaches to help survivors on their healing journey. So without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Michael, who can get us started.
Thank you, Eugenia, and to the Office for Victims of Crime for your ongoing commitment to identifying impact of trauma, offering ongoing resources to survivors and victim service professionals and our allies to effectively address the impact of trauma in a way that is trauma-informed and based upon evidence. So the power of the personal story of mass violence survivors and lived experience of those who serve them have been driving forces of the National Mass Violence Center since our inception in 2017. I'm pleased to introduce a very inspiring video clip from Brittany Thomas, a mass violence survivor herself, and a member of our center's Survivors and Providers Steering Committee.
Hello, My name is Brittany Thomas. 26 years ago, when I was just 15 years old, I survived one of America's first school shootings in Paducah, Kentucky at Heath High School on December 1st, 1997. As the shooting unfolded, I was standing next to my close friend as she and many other classmates were shot and killed all around me. In the days and weeks that followed, a lot of well-meaning people from all over the country showed up to help us, but few of them had any kind of experience with this kind of trauma. On the advice of the professionals, we were sent back to school the very next morning. I remember going back to school that day, and a crisis counselor instantly came up to me and asked me if I was okay. It must have been obvious I wasn't, because when I looked down, I realized I had on two different shoes, and both my shirt and my jacket were on inside out. As shock from that day began to fade, I started struggling with anxiety, panic attacks, depression, and undiagnosed PTSD. I also found myself struggling at times to complete even the simplest of tasks, like fixing my hair, getting dressed, and making breakfast. Because Heath High School was one of the first shootings that occurred in the country, there were no playbooks or manuscripts or best practice models to help show us or our teachers and administrators on what to do or what not to do. Heath High School became an anomaly to the world, and as teenagers, we were forced to chart our own path in uncharted territory, and we had to do it in front of the media with the whole world scrutinizing our every move. The only way I can describe it is it's like being on board a speeding train and just throwing down the tracks as they fall, hoping they fall into the next right place. As the trial date for the shooting approached, I was subpoenaed to testify in court. When I asked if I would be allowed to read a victim's impact statement at the sentencing hearing, I was told no, that because I wasn't physically injured, I wasn't even considered a quote, real victim, and I should feel lucky because nothing had even really happened to me. For years, I struggled to understand how if I wasn't really a victim and nothing happened to me, then why was I struggling so much? If my wounds weren't physical, did they really even matter? In the years that followed after Heath, more shootings started to happen, and before we could blink, mass shootings were happening all over the country in venues outside of schools. Malls, movie theaters, churches, grocery stores, concerts, elementary schools, colleges. It seemed like nothing and no one was immune. Each time another shooting happened, more people were suddenly finding themselves members of a club no one ever wants to join. My heart always sinks a little deeper each time another shooting happens and I hear it on the news. Even after all this time, when I see news of another shooting, I notice my anxiety increases, my depression creeps back in. Sometimes I start having nightmares, and I'm also a lot more hypervigilant in public spaces. But over the years, and with the help of some amazing therapists, I've learned how to better manage my PTSD and depression, and also how to give myself compassion when my symptoms spike at the news of another shooting. I've also learned that healing is possible and often happens best in community. The interesting thing about trauma is that not only does it have the power to destroy, but when given the right help and resources, it can also transform and redeem. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany. And Steve Siegel is next. He's been a dedicated advocate for crime victims and survivors for over 40 years. And he's responded to countless mass violence incidents nationwide across his career. So our center is fortunate to have him as a longtime consultant to our important work.
Hi, I'm Steve Siegel, and I am honored to have a few moments to talk to you today about our community's response to mass violence incidents. I've been doing this work for a really long time, back to the late 1970s, with trainings beginning in the early 80s and continuing on. And I've responded in excess of 20 incidents, including on scene as a consultant and as oversight of programs and funding. It's been our approach to always be committed to multidisciplinary collaboration. It's central to all the work we do in serving crime victims, and that has never been more clear than when we built the Colorado-Oklahoma Resource Council in the aftermath of the bombing. And we came together in a manner that has become a metaphor for true collaboration. Federal, state, city, and law enforcement, prosecution, the courts, the private sector, and the spiritual community, day in and day out. learning these lessons, delivering these services in a manner that we acknowledge the physical, psychological, financial, social, and spiritual impacts that are cutting at the fabric of these communities that are impacted by this mass violence. The heart of the learning that creates and defines these strategies for response is to learn the history of the community that's impacted. You will not know how to build a sustainable plan unless you truly learn about the community, the strengths and challenges, cultural considerations, languages and social norms, barriers, social determinants, financial hurdles, prior traumas, both chronic and acute. Is there a live defendant? Is there political leadership that understands this? There's little in this that is new, just the need to learn about our communities, how they've been impacted. It's an ultra marathon with a sprint at the start. It'll be closely observed and evaluated. It includes the prying eyes of the press. It will include skeptics and those who thrive on the negative. It will include deeply felt offers of assistance. You must commit to self-evaluation of your capacity to serve. Understand that you must fit your collaboration into an existing structure, and you must learn the ABCs of our field. Speak the truth to power. You must listen with all your senses. You must believe in true collaboration. As the sign said at the door of the studio where We Are the World was recorded, leave your egos at the door. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany and Steve, for centering our discussion about trauma across the lifespan. So what a great foundation for this national town hall. And now to our panelists. I am pleased to present Dr. Alyssa Reingold, who will be providing an overview of trauma across the lifespan and its impact on victims, survivors, and community members affected by mass violence.
Thank you, Michael. And good afternoon, everyone. Here to talk just overview about trauma and kind of understanding it, understanding definitions and context that goes along with trauma and the potential impact it may have on people who experience mass violence incidents specifically. Go to the next slide. So I first want to just start off and talk a little bit about the definition of trauma. Often the term trauma sometimes gets used to describe an event, and sometimes it gets used to describe a reaction. So the traditional approach to thinking about trauma often usually is interactive. It's usually an event that usually involves some type of characteristics that involve life-threatening components, and an event that produces psychological reactions. And so sometimes it can be used interchangeably. Not all potentially traumatic events can bring on those type of trauma responses or reactions, because people respond very differently to different types of events. People sometimes use the term trauma in somewhat imprecise ways. Sometimes they can use it to describe distressing things, but it may not necessarily rise to the level of a traumatic event. And sometimes they use the word trauma to describe reminders about an event. But a reminder in itself isn't always re-traumatizing. Someone isn't getting exposed to another life-threatening event necessarily, but sometimes people use that term in that way. So SAMHSA's definition of trauma, and SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Their definition of trauma is an individual trauma is an event or circumstance resulting in physical harm, emotional harm, or life-threatening harm that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's mental health, physical health, emotional health, social well-being, or spiritual well-being. So that combination of an event paired with the impact of that event. Often trauma is unusual, often it's unanticipated, it's often unpredictable, and it sometimes can shatter our assumptions. Trauma also, according to SAMHSA, doesn't always occur in a vacuum. So individual trauma can occur in the context of community, and that community can be defined as geography, neighborhoods, could be the community of shared identity or ethnicity or experience, or places of work or worship. And how a community responds to individual trauma sort of sets that foundation of that impact it can have on an individual and groups of people. Go to the next slide. So according to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, or the DSM, there are a number of different what we consider potentially traumatic events. So events that could bring on those type of trauma reactions or symptoms. Like I said, not all of these events for everybody brings on that type of response because people respond differently. But there are a number of different potentially traumatic events, natural disasters, war, terrorism, serious injury or illness or medical procedures, car accidents, crashes, witnessing violence, either in the home or in the community, intimate partner violence, other types of interpersonal violence like sexual assault, physical assaults, as well as neglect. We'll go to the next slide. However, what's not mentioned in the DSM, but is identified as potentially traumatic and probably will be included in future iterations, given kind of the research that's being done, or oppression and racism and even discrimination. And so we want to take those in context, and we'll talk about in a minute context when it comes to mass violence incidents. You can go to the next slide. So there's lots of different types of trauma, and all of these relate to mass violence in unique ways. So we have our individual trauma. Individual trauma is a potentially traumatic event that I as an individual may experience. It can be singular or repeated, and it can be chronic. And so in a mass violence incident, individuals are impacted. We also can experience trauma in a cumulative fashion. So cumulative trauma is the loading of multiple traumas over the course of a lifetime. So me as an individual could experience multiple different traumatic events or potentially traumatic events over the course of my life, and they have a cumulative impact on itself. So if a person were to experience a mass violence incident, their cumulative prior trauma experiences might influence how they respond to that mass violence incident. Then we also have collective trauma. And collective trauma is pretty much an event or a series of events that impact a large group of people or peoples or community. So mass violence is a collective trauma because when it occurs to an entire community. Now, this could have implications because an entire community is impacted and can be experiencing trauma reactions as a community, and individuals within that community, right, also experiencing their own trauma responses. And so there's often sort of a tension, if you will, or bouncing off each other with individual trauma paired with that collective trauma reacting to other people's individual traumas and communities. And then you have generational trauma or intergenerational trauma. And intergenerational trauma implies is a traumatic event that takes place to either an individual or family or community and kind of gets passed down to subsequent generations. So it can imply, for instance, that parents can pass down unresolved tensions or feelings from either their own families of origin, they've experienced trauma, onto their children, both through epigenetics, as well as even perhaps through their parenting style. You can go to the next slide. Now, historical trauma is an example of intergenerational trauma, and it refers to the legacy of traumatic events that are experienced by a collective group of people. So often these groups of people are faced by oppression or social and psychological effects that can occur from generation to generation. So some examples of widespread effects of system oppression or historical trauma could be the oppression of indigenous communities, or African Americans who've experienced generational slavery, segregation, or institutional racism. And that has importance and relevance in the context of mass violence, because when we're responding to and offering recovery resources to communities and individuals, we have to take in context one's exposure to these other types of traumas, one's relationship with historical trauma, one's interactions that they may have had with systems, both individually and historically over generations. Now, racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress, we also can call it, well, race-based traumatic stress is a cumulative effect of racism on an individual's mental, behavioral, and physical health. Again, paying attention to race-based trauma is important when we're working with communities, especially marginalized populations. They may have a higher prevalence of experienced race-based trauma. And when we talk about trying to do outreach and work with communities in recovery after mass violence incidents, we have to pay attention to the important role that this may play and how people experience their own trauma in that mass violence incident and how they experience working with institutions and providers. Identity or hate-based trauma is violence against a person that's motivated by bias and prejudice against that person's perceived group membership. That can include race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, national origin, disability, or other personal characteristics. And unfortunately, our country have experienced a number of hate-based mass violence incidents, which adds to the complexity of individuals and communities that may have experienced that type of mass violence incident. Not only for that individual community that were the direct victims, but then all those groups that were part of that targeted population of that identity-based crime. So it has a ripple effect across many individuals. And then we have vicarious or secondary trauma, which is the indirect trauma that can occur when you're exposed to difficult or disturbing images or stories secondhand. And vicarious and secondary trauma are often used interchangeably. There's some slight unique differences, but often people use those a little bit interchangeably. I do want to say, however, that direct trauma, right, refers to traumatic events that occurs directly to us. And so a first responder who's called to a mass violence incident may actually have direct trauma with the result of what they may have experienced during that incident. Victim service professionals may be susceptible to vicarious trauma from mass violence incidents if they've, working with and hearing the number of different stories that they may have and working with victims that have been impacted by mass violence. So what is the impact of trauma on individuals? Well, in the immediate response in the moment, we may experience what's called fight, flight, or freeze response. And that's really our adaptive response to dangerous situations. It's helpful for us to protect ourselves and survive those situations. And the range of those reactions can depend on the individual and how they typically respond to dangerous situations. Now, the long-term impact, we can have a range of reactions, and there really is no one response. And I think that's really important message to come across today, is that people differ in how they respond to trauma. There's not a typical response. We're going to talk about different ways people can respond, but there is not one specific way. It's unique to each individual. However, some people can be at risk of, we'll talk about in a minute, about developing symptoms related to post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or substance use, and they may even be at risk for suicidal thoughts. And some may be resilient and really have no symptoms at all. And so, as I mentioned, there's sort of a wide range. Trauma can impact what I like to call the ABCs with a long S on that, ABCs. So that includes our affect and our emotions, right? And our emotional response in the aftermath. It can include our behaviors, what we do, how we respond in the future to going into public, perhaps, or how we engage and behave around other people. It can impact us physically. Some folks report more physiological symptoms of trauma, like headaches or stomach aches. And so it can just impact us physically. It can impact us cognitively. What are we thinking? And our beliefs about the world, our beliefs about others, and about safety in general. And then it also can impact spiritually. For some people, can struggle spiritually after a mass violence incident. It can impact us socially, just how we engage socially, but it also can impact culturally, how we engage with, our culture and in both protective ways, as well as potentially can impact our ongoing difficulties. And I want to kind of point out that all these experiences can not only impact direct victims, like victims and survivors that may have experienced both physical and psychological injury in a situation, but it can impact indirect victims. So those can be family members, friends of loved ones, and friends whose loved ones may have experienced a potentially traumatic event. So they may not have necessarily been there at the time, but if their loved one was a direct victim, it can have an impact on them. And Dr. Hansen will probably talk a little bit more about that and how that interrelates when it comes to children and parents, when we're thinking about across the lifespan. So this is just kind of a slide that demonstrates just looking at individual resilience trajectories. This is a very overly simplified slide, I have to say, because sometimes these trajectories are a little bit all over the place. But this is looking at the trajectory of potentially developing more long-term problems like post-traumatic stress disorder. So some people can struggle at the beginning and continue to struggle. Some people may not struggle at all and continue to be resilient. Some people may struggle at first and then recover over time, and some people may have a delayed response. You can go to the next slide. Some, not everybody, because often people can be resilient and be in kind of have a range of responses, but some people may go on to develop what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD is it is considered a mental health diagnosis after experiencing trauma, and it involves a certain number of types of criteria or symptoms that someone may experience. These include intrusions like nightmares or images or reminders that bring on distress. It can include avoiding thinking about, avoiding situations that bring on distress, and it include a host of mood and thought-related struggles like guilt, shame, and blame, survivor guilt, for instance, inability to experience positive emotions, as well as arousal symptoms, irritability, being on guard, maybe poor concentration and sleep difficulties. Go to the next slide. So why do some people get PTSD while others do not? Well, there's a host of reasons. Some of it is personal factors. What I bring to the table before I experience a traumatic event, my prior victimization, excuse me, perhaps, or my prior coping strategies. It could be characteristics about the traumatic event itself, the context, my exposure to what I may have experienced during it. And it can also be the recovery environment, which is really important for us as providers who might be helping people in the aftermath. What does that look like? Are there stressors related to my recovery individually and or the community response that can impact symptomatology? Go to the next slide. And then folks can experience lots of other problems in addition. Struggles with employment, with medical illness, with quality of life, relationship struggles, and struggles at home and at work. You can go to the next slide. There are a number of factors that lead to increased risk for mental health difficulties. These include pre-incident characteristics. So those could be, as I mentioned, my prior exposure, my prior coping skills that include the incident itself and what I may have experienced during the incident, and the characteristics about the incident, where was it at, what types of incident it was, and then media exposure can actually have an impact as well on my ongoing recovery after a mass violence incident. Sort of already mentioned some pre-existing factors. These included past trauma exposure. We know from some research that prior trauma exposure increases risk for community members who've been impacted by mass violence incidents. Prior mental health struggles can also increase risk. And some difficulties with coping, for instance, using alcohol, substances can increase risk. But there's a host of protective factors, and so I don't want to lose sight of that. Social support is extraordinarily protective and a great buffer. Having a sense of meaning and purpose in life is a protective factor. Managing emotions and managing physical reactions to distress can be a protective factor. Interpersonal skills and how we communicate our needs can be protective. Problem solving and planning skills can also be protective. Go to the next slide. That is an individual, and then as a community, also very protective factors such as social support. So support we get from our community. Culture can be really protective. Our traditions and how they help us manage distress and stressors in life, we can lean on that as protective. Social determinants of health can be protective. It could also put us at risk. And social determinants of health are the environments that we live in. They are communities. They are our education that we are able to get. They are kind of our environments that we're in. And then our access and provision to resources can be protective as well. Go to the next slide. So I want to end a little on this slide. With this, I talked a little bit about a lot of individual reactions to trauma and stress. And this is just a slide from SAMHSA that demonstrates community phases after disaster. Now, mass violence is different from disaster, so I want to put that caveat out there. And some of this terminology might be different for mass violence, but I want to highlight that communities as a whole can be impacted and struggle. I have not met one community impacted by mass violence that say, as a community, we've done great throughout the entire recovery and resilience process. A lot of communities struggle, and they struggle for a while. And I think that's really important for leaders to pay attention to, that this is not something communities move on with, because you don't move on, you move with. And that a lot of work needs to be done to kind of continue to foster that connection in communities and sense of safety and sense of support. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michael.
Thanks, Alyssa, for reminding us of the different types of trauma and traumatic events and the complexity of that, and even including things that we don't often think about enough. Making sure that we're taking into consideration the context, also looking at historical racial trauma, identity hate-based trauma, and vicarious and secondary trauma, and the complexity having to do with risk and different protective factors at the individual level and also at the community level, and the various ways that trauma can impact individuals and communities. So thank you so much for sharing that. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Rochelle Hansen. And she's going to share information about how mass violence events can impact children, adolescents, young adults, and families.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Alyssa, for providing such a great foundation. My challenge is going to be sharing information and keeping it from being redundant. So I'm going to try my best to tailor the content that I'm going to share with you so that we can have a better understanding of how this is influenced by a child and an individual, I should say, an individual's development and age. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump in and talk a little bit about the impact of mass violence. And as already been mentioned, there is no one single way that an individual might respond after a mass violence incident. We see things like fear and anxiety to sadness and depression or anger, a lot of feelings like the world is no longer safe. And then, as Dr. Reingold mentioned, just having those who do go on to develop PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And that isn't a huge number of people, but we certainly want to make sure we have services available to those folks. And Dr. Moreland will be talking about that in a minute. And I'll touch a little bit about complicated grief and how that can be expressed in kids. In addition to a lot of the psychological and behavioral impacts that we see after an event like a mass violence event, we also know, particularly among kids, that the way those kinds of reactions are manifested is physically. So kids might be more likely to talk about headaches or stomach aches or their tummy hurting. Adolescents may feel like they can't breathe or their heart is racing so intensely. I'm struck by what Brittany said earlier and the fact that for some individuals, they might feel kind of confused, or if they're walking around in a fog, and that's not an uncommon way to feel after a mass violence incident. Others may feel like kind of a tightness in their chest. Parents may see that their children have this change in appetite. They're either not hungry anymore or they're eating even more often or more frequently than they had in the past. And then it's not uncommon to also see across the developmental spectrum a lot of changes in sleep habits, from being very tired to not being able to sleep, or that fatigue is caused by sleep difficulties. Kids aren't getting a good night's sleep. Here's the really good news, though. I feel like we're always talking about a lot of negative things, but one of the things to keep in mind is that most people, number one, nearly everyone will have an immediate response to something like a mass violence incident, and that immediate response is going to be quite intense. But the good news is that for most people, those kinds of symptoms will decline over time. So one example was a study that occurred after 9/11, and what we found out was up to 50% of individuals had fewer than 3 PTSD symptoms. And about 10% to about a third had mild symptoms, but rapidly improved. And then there were a small number that had more severe symptoms that did persist or increase over time. So what does this look like in children? Number one, like I mentioned earlier, some kids are going to show a lot of fear. The world is not safe. They are afraid to leave their rooms. They're afraid to go to school because they feel like there's no place that they could go where they'll be safe, right? If a shooting occurs at school or in their place of worship or in a mall, like where do you go where you could feel safe? Other kids may feel a lot of anxiety and worry or difficulty concentrating. Not uncommon to see increases in anger and irritability. And again, a lot of sadness. And as I mentioned before, those physical kinds of reactions. We also know that the way an individual responds to a mass violence incident is going to vary by their age or developmental level. And I keep going back and forth because some folks may chronologically be 14 or 15, but they're actually functioning at a much younger or an older level. So we want to think about that developmental level as well. So in really young children, the 3-4-year-olds, we're going to see that increase in fear in new situations, as well as anxiety about being separated from a caregiver who is perceived as a safe person. In young children, we may also see an increase in their startle response. We may see an increase in aggression or aggressive outbursts. We also may see regression. So a child, for example, a toddler who had been able to sleep in their own room, who was already potty trained, after something very traumatic, they may regress to a former kind of behavior. And then as kids get older, we're also going to see challenges and difficulties with their abilities to regulate their emotions. As you get older, you kind of see a little bit different sense of or type of presentation. So among school age kids who are more able to talk about their thoughts, you may hear them talk about more intrusive thoughts where they can't stop thinking about what happened. They may, again, become more withdrawn or aggressive. In terms of how they're performing in school, you may see poor concentration. They may become easily distracted. Again, those same problems about emotion regulation. And not surprisingly, given these problems, there may be a decline in their school performance. Adolescence is kind of an interesting time because they are struggling with wanting to be separated from their parents and be more independent. And at the same time, after a tragic event happens, they may actually seek out and need their parents even more. They may also be very embarrassed by the way they are responding to a reminder or of that traumatic event. So what can often happen with adolescents because of some of that is this increase in anger, They may withdraw because they are embarrassed or uncomfortable about how they're feeling in terms of the traumatic event they experienced. Again, that poor school performance. You may also see an increase in risky behaviors that we have to pay attention to. And one of the things about adolescence, which isn't all that different than almost like a toddler, is this sense that I am the only one, this kind of narcissism or only ability to see the world through their own lens. Very normal thing in adolescence that can be magnified after a traumatic event. And then there's just this ongoing kind of conflict and struggle towards a very normal developmental task of adolescence, which is separation, independence, and autonomy, and more time with peers, which is kind of an interesting dilemma after a traumatic event. Then there's something very unique in, kind of thinking about those transition age youth, going from adolescence to young adulthood. Again, some of the similarities, right? A lot of fear, anger, jumpiness, but even more, there may be this sense of survivor's guilt. Like, why was I okay when I watched my best friend get killed? Like Brittany in the clip we saw earlier talked about seeing people right next to her who had been shot and killed. And I wouldn't be surprised if she also had some of that survivor's guilt. Why did I escape from this when others didn't? Kind of feeling on edge and jumpy and helpless. The poor school performance. And then since this age group is moving into jobs and occupations, that can also be impaired. A lot of avoidance, thinking about these things, reminders. And the other big challenge in this age, since they are often transitioning away from home, whether they're going to college or getting married or developing more serious relationships and moving away from their family of origin, that can present some challenges in feeling kind of divided loyalties between their family of origin and the new family that they are developing. The other thing I'm so mindful of when I think about children and the way they respond to a traumatic event, as one of my colleagues said, kids can have both tics and fleas. And by that, I mean a child might have attention deficit disorder and anxiety or PTSD at the same time. And it can honestly be difficult to differentiate between the two because the presentations can overlap. We also might see things like oppositional defiant disorder, which people may kind of mislabel a child who's engaging in those kinds of oppositional behaviors when in fact, that's the way they are dealing with the traumatic event that they experienced. And again, it's not uncommon to see a lot of these anxiety problems, whether it rises to the level of a disorder, really is going to depend on how long those symptoms are persisting and the severity of those symptoms. Another thing that's important to think about are adults who have experienced a traumatic event when they were young, when they were a child, and now are experiencing another traumatic event. Like Dr. Reingold mentioned earlier, there are the impact of these cumulative traumatic events, and unfortunately, worse is more. And we know that adults who experienced a traumatic event as a child, that the impact of that early traumatic event can persist across the lifespan, and that those early exposures to traumatic events do increase the risk for physical, mental, and behavioral health problems. And when they are compounded by ongoing adversities and additional exposure to trauma, we see an exacerbation of those problems as they move into adulthood. And again, as I mentioned earlier, are these unique challenges as adults transition away from their home, away from their family of origin. So just kind of really honing in again and re-emphasizing this importance of what might impact someone's response to a traumatic event. There are those components or elements of a traumatic event that are objective, right? We know that the more severe the trauma, so in the case of mass violence, the more people that are killed, the more people that are injured, that's going to impact someone's response. The individual's own proximity to the event and whether or not they experience an injury themselves, the more proximity, that's going to increase the more severe reaction, as well as the subjective experience, right? Whether an individual experienced this sense of helplessness and horror and terror, thought that they were going to be seriously injured or killed, or that someone they loved and cared about would be injured or killed, or feeling like they could have done something to prevent the event. And that latter point is particularly common and salient among teens because teens feel like, I should have been there. I should have been the one to protect. I could have done something to help. What else impacts the response is, again, that pre-existing exposure to a traumatic event. And of course, just because of age, Older youth, teens, and these young adults are more likely to have had prior experiences, and that can impact how they respond to a more acute event. If they are struggling or have a history of prior mental health problems, that's also going to impact. So a teenager who has struggled with depression or behavior problems throughout their lives, then they experience a new event, they're going to have a more difficult response. The importance of environmental factors, things like family and peer supports, cannot be understated. They are critical to helping in the aftermath of a violent event, as well as social support. And hate crime is a really kind of a unique type of event, especially if that child, that teenager, that young adult shares an identity with the intended victim. That can be incredibly confusing. You know, something that occurs, for example, in a place of worship, and you share that same religious background, you may be questioning, why do people hate Jewish people? Why do people hate Blacks or African Americans? That's who I am. Do I have to walk around in my world and be afraid because I share that identity? And then again, just being faced with ongoing adversities can be particularly challenging for kids. Very, very important is that the way a caregiver responds to an event has an incredibly important impact on the child. Younger kids look to their caregivers to figure out how they should respond. So that's why it's so important to provide resources and support to caregivers, so that will trickle down and enable them to be more supportive for their own kids. And we also know that exposure to media and social media, we have to really pay attention to when we're talking about children and adolescents. Some other things that we need to pay attention to is just the cultural background of a family. We know that values and norms related to death and dying and grief is going to be extremely important. The way that a family views sharing and expressing emotions is going to be very different, and we want to find out more about that. The way psychological symptoms are defined or described is going to vary across different cultural groups. And there's going to be differences in language and acculturation and assimilation that is also going to impact. And there can be very significant differences between a caregiver and a child that we want to pay attention to. And then lastly, there are going to be differences in the perspectives on seeking help depending on someone's cultural background. And I just want to go back that the idea of how someone talks about death and dying and grief is going to be very important when we're talking about children. The acceptance, the openness to having those conversations is going to be very variable depending upon the background of the family. So just a few more points. One, we've already talked about the impact of cumulative trauma, exposure to multiple events, worse is more, and the cues or reminders of those cumulative traumas are going to vary across individuals. And then a collective trauma is going to be especially important when we think about kids and think about, for example, mass violence incidents like a school shooting, because that is a collective trauma, but the way each individual describes or thinks or responds to that is going to vary based on a lot of those individual factors that we were talking about. And then the final thing I'd like to share is just thinking about the difference between PTSD versus grief. And this can be impactful for kids. So reminders, traumatic events like images, sounds, and smells are different than a lost reminder. So images, sounds, and smells are the reminders of something that was lost for that individual. When we're talking about kids, things like people, places, and situations can be very strong and important trauma reminders. I think one more slide there. So things like a classroom, a place of worship, a shopping mall, alarms, bells, the speakers, drills at schools can be very impactful traumatic reminders, as can a day of the week, a certain class, because it's connected to that prior traumatic event. And then even things like the way the person felt at the time of the trauma can be a cue or a reminder back to that particular traumatic event. And then when we talk about a loss reminder, we're talking about things that remind the individual of someone they love that they lost: an empty seat at the dinner table, an empty classroom, an activity that had been shared together with the person that they lost, celebrations that are reminders of things that they no longer will be able to have with the person that they lost. Final takeaways, reactions to mass violence incidents are very similar, but they do vary depending upon the age and developmental level of the child. Most kids are going to be okay, but those feelings of grief and loss can persist. Individual, family, and environmental factors are very important to consider because they impact severity and duration. And young adults are going to be particularly affected because they are transitioning from one stage in life to another. And finally, really important to learn about the cultural background of the family that we are working with, because that is going to be very relevant to all the different things that we talked about. And on that, I am going to go ahead and let Angie, and I'll come back to any questions anybody has about the critical importance of caregivers.
All right, thanks, Rochelle, for sharing all this information, making it really clear that we have to keep in mind that kids and adolescents are not mini adults, and that we have to pay attention to an individual's age, their developmental level, to help them with the aftermath of a mass violence incident, and then the importance of caregivers and environment in helping children and adolescents in their recovery. And now Angela Moreland is going to share information about the phases of mass violence incident victim assistance, including evidence-based strategies to utilize throughout these phases.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you to Rochelle and Alyssa again for setting the stage and kind of bringing us up to this point. So we're going to start out with the phases of mass violence victim assistance. And we'll kind of come back to this figure several times throughout the presentation, because really when we talk about the evidence-based strategies and different tools that can be used, although many of them can be used across multiple different stages, they really do center across or center on a certain specific period of time that is most important, and depending on where the person is in their healing. So just because it doesn't necessarily mean week 1, week 2, week 3, or week 4, it much more means that they may be kind of in this response type of phase or in this recovery and resiliency type of phase. And to go back to what Alyssa was saying, that will differ for everyone. So for one person, their response phase may be a couple of weeks, whereas for some others, it may be much longer. And that's okay. There's no right or wrong way. We only kind of make these phases in order to give a typical timeline or path for people. To talk first about this response phase, so we're not going to talk about planning today, although as Michael mentioned earlier, we do have a large preparedness area within our center. So if anyone's interested in hearing more about preparedness, you will hear that in another avenue. Within response, we're talking about what happens right after an incident. So a mass violence incident occurs in the community. What are the very first things that happen? And right away, the FBI's National Victim Services Response Team comes in. OVC TTAC, which is the Officer Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance, when invited, they often come in or will come in. And these are to provide rapid, broad, and immediate help. And really, our team now comes in from a behavioral health and mental health perspective to be able to provide those. But regardless of who it is providing the services right at first, what is really needed is triaging those needs. So we hear multiple times, I have a couple of survivors that I've talked to who, the day after an incident, someone said, you need to go into one-on-one intervention therapy the day after. And that's not really what's needed the day after. What's really needed right away is triaging these needs. And those needs will be similar across multiple people, but they also may be very different. So some of these needs, though, surround physical safety, medical care, physical needs. So based on the setting of the incident, we may need to assess for housing, food, clothing, transportation, funds, kind of where the family and the individual is right now, right after the incident. Problem solving, there's a lot of problem solving, both at the individual and the community level that occurs. Communication with loved ones, emotional support and psychoeducation, and really information. So what's needed right away, and we hear this from victims and communities over and over again, is they really need to know what's happening, or know whether they're safe and what's happening in the moment and what information are they going to need moving forward. Now, they may not remember all of this information, so it's important to be able to provide this in multiple different ways, whether that's written material, that's where self-help resources like websites, apps, media, and a range of different settings and institutions can be helpful so that they can have that ongoing kind of self-help and really to know some psychoeducation about what they should be experiencing right now, with knowing that that is a range of emotions and a range of different areas. Psychological first aid is a very in the immediate is a tool and a strategy that we'll talk about in a couple minutes. So within the public health model of prevention, you have kind of this hierarchy. So everyone's probably seen this triangle when it comes to multiple different stages of needs or stages of skills that are needed. And we talk about this all the way from the bottom up to the top. So really, down here at the bottom, we consider this primary prevention. And this would be prevention of a range of different concerns. So this could mean mental health disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, but also could just mean distress and stress and grief, all kinds of different reactions. So those early interventions really need to hit a broad range of people, which is why it's at the bottom of this triangle. So those are early interventions and they're available to all victims and survivors. So at this point, we don't really need to assess in the moment people who were present or people who knew someone present at an incident. We don't need to assess who needs what right then. What we really need to do is provide these early interventions to everyone and triage needs. Once you go up the triangle a little bit, that's where we hit interventions like skills of psychological recovery. And that's where we do start to assess those who might be more at risk. And this doesn't necessarily mean individual one-on-one treatment yet, but it means people who are more at risk or who may need some ongoing services. We go ahead and provide some intervention. And I'll talk about what those interventions look like in a minute. Then once we get to the top of the triangle, these are interventions for people with trauma-related mental health problems. So as Alyssa and Rochelle really laid out very well, is that everyone is not in need of, everyone doesn't go on to develop trauma-related mental health concerns and may not develop them at the same level. So we really have to assess and figure out who is in need of these interventions and how can we deliver them in the most effective way possible, knowing that it won't be everyone. It's not that dark orange part of the triangle at the very bottom. So first, when we think about that dark, so keep going back to that triangle. I should have put it in the background to kind of continue to orient. But when we think about the bottom part of that triangle, so everyone, psychological first aid is a phenomenal resource to be able to deliver to all victims and all people present at the incident. And this goes into first responders too, which we'll talk about specifically in a little while. So psychological first aid is an evidence-informed approach. And the whole goal of psychological first aid is to assist in the immediate aftermath of a trauma and to really foster that short and long-term adaptive functioning. So it's not meant to be an intervention for mental health concerns or mental health symptoms. It's much more to stabilize and really foster that functioning and be able to set the stage up for healing and recovery moving on. So it's best delivered in the first 24 to 48 hours, or I'm sorry, 24 to 72 hours. So it really is immediate. And there's a manual that's available in multiple different languages. We have the link down here to be able to go to the training for psychological first aid, but we can also provide that to anyone that's interested as well. The 7 key components of psychological first aid, you can see that they really hit on that need for triage and for establishing safety and resilience and kind of setting up that, that path for adaptive healing. So you're caring for immediate needs. If you start up at the top, and we'll kind of go around to the right, caring for immediate needs, protecting from future threat or distress. So that's where that safety piece really comes in. Providing comfort and consoling those that are in need, providing support for practical tasks. So many people may need actual logistical support to be able to solve problems, to be able to connect with loved ones, to be able to figure out next steps moving forward. to provide information on coping. So we're not necessarily providing that long-term treatment. We're providing information on how you cope in the short term to set the stage for being able to cope in the longer term. Help to connect with social supports. So we know from research and from clinical work that social support is a very, very key buffer for healing, both in the short term and in the long term. So if we can go ahead and start connecting people with social support, that will set the stage very nicely for their future recovery. And then educate about normal responses. So there are a lot of responses, which Rochelle and Alyssa very nicely laid out. After a mass violence incident occurs, it can really cause a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, a lot of very heightened trauma responses in an individual. And if someone isn't informed about those and educated about those, that can be very scary. So a lot of times just educating that these responses are normal. This fear is normal. And this is it's going to look like over the next days, over the next weeks, over the next months. And if it doesn't look like this, and if it's worse than this, then here's what you do. That in and of itself can provide a lot of reassurance and a lot of hope for people, and can reduce anxiety just right there, knowing that these responses are normal and I'm not crazy. These aren't coming out of nowhere. There's a reason that we can tie these responses in these ways that my body is feeling. The great news, another piece, I guess, of great news about PFA is that it can be delivered by basically anyone. So it does not take a professional. It does not take a clinician. It's supposed to be a model that is delivered by a broad range of people. So, and it can be delivered in a variety of settings. So it can be delivered in family assistance centers, in local police departments, hospitals, emergency departments, and it even can be delivered via phone. So it really is meant to be all inclusive. So that was the response phase. Now we move on to that recovery and resiliency phase. And like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly 1 month, but it means outside of that acute response. What happens going forward? And we have a lot of really great interventions and models to be able to address the symptoms that come up in these phases. In this phase, really the goals are to resume everyday activities, process and resolve issues related to the events, facilitate effective grieving. So really set up that healing process and set up that grieving process, and recalibrating to the new normal. So a lot of things have changed. Even if they haven't changed with a person's immediate family, things have changed in the community and things have changed in people's day-to-day living. So really recalibrating to that, and then seeking a future orientation. During this phase, we really want to assess and triage the needs for ongoing mental health. So that's where we get to that middle kind of lighter orange of the triangle. So that's where we're going to provide ongoing services. And those can be provided through Resiliency Center, through case management, through community coordination, coordinated evidence-based support, memorial services, observances, kind of overall, it will be needed through a variety of settings and for a variety of different reasons. Skills for Psychological Recovery is an evidence-informed intervention that can be used during this phase, and it's to identify needs and teach coping skills to address those needs. So it's delivered in 3 to 5 sessions. It's meant to be very short and very sweet. It's not a mental health treatment. Instead, it teaches skills. So just remember that, skills for psychological recovery. It emphasizes helping victims and survivors regain a sense of control. So you've moved past that triage, and now you're moving into some skills in order to get people through this phase. The skills here are problem-solving skills, promoting positive activities, managing reactions, promoting helpful thinking, and really rebuilding those healthy social connections. Once we move past those skills, there are several people who will be in need of evidence-based treatment. So that goes into that highest level of that triangle. So evidence-based trauma treatments, there are many for multiple different age groups, and I'll talk about the different ones. So for children and adolescents, these are just some: TFCBT, trauma and grief component therapy, and prolonged exposure, which is an adult treatment, but there is a manual to be used for adolescents as well. These are trauma-focused treatments. They're time-limited, and they're 12 to 15 weekly sessions. So the children and adolescent treatments involve child, adolescent, and the caregiver. And these in the next few slides are delivered by a trained mental health provider who's trained in trauma-informed approaches. For adults, many of the therapies that are used, the evidence-based therapies that are used are prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, complicated grief therapy, written exposure therapy, and the grief approach. And you see some pictures of these manuals over here on the side. Similar to the child treatments, they're trauma focused. They include exposure and or cognitive components, depending on which treatment we're talking about, and have a grief focus. And again, they're supposed to be time limited. So what about first responders? Within first responders, I want to make sure to talk specifically about them. Any of the treatments that we've just talked about can be used for first responders. And to go specifically to what Alyssa was saying earlier is first responders were there at the scene and were there. So it's very important to make sure we focus on their needs and that they may need treatment as well. A couple to point out for acute intervention, psychological first aid, which I talked about, has been adapted for firefighters. So that's called stress first aid. If you're interested in the manual or in the training for that, I can provide that for you. Such as one way that it has been adapted. And then ongoing treatment, any of these trauma focused therapies are important. One thing that's extremely important to talk about with first responders is, though, so often we talk to first responders who seek out treatment and then they either aren't happy with treatment or it doesn't meet their needs. And it's very, very important. Most of the times that happens is because they're not going to a provider who is trauma focused and evidence-based and also understands first responder culture. So you really have to have those two pieces. You have to have the trauma and you have to have the first responder culture. So that's a very important component to make sure. And where we are kind of in our landscape right now is people are understanding the need for treatments for first responders at this point. First responders are starting to seek out treatment more than they have in the past, but we really need to build up from a clinician standpoint, this understanding of first responder culture and really build up our workforce in this area so that first responders are going to providers that they feel meet their needs and understand their culture. And then lastly, just understanding communities and victims vary. They need different services. So we mentioned all of these different services, and yes, they are all very helpful, but it's not a one size fits all. So just understanding that they do vary based on the person, and they do very much vary based on where they are. One other kind of piece to mention is trauma cues. So we've talked about kind of through the lifespan, and I think it's very, very important to mention that as additional mass violence incidents occur throughout the country, children and adults often experience trauma cues. So they often are re-cued by those instances that happen. And a lot of these symptoms that we've all talked about can tend to come up again. So it's important to make sure that we understand that in this context, we've been talking a lot about the symptoms and the treatments and the things that you can do immediately following or long-term following your own mass violence incident. But it's very important to talk about when we talk about the lifespan that these can come up even after your mass violence incident as other incidents occur across the country and serve as reminders of that incident. So making sure that we know all these skills that we've talked about today really are according to your own, but really can be useful and may be important to go back to as additional mass violence incidents occur across the country. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Michael.
Thanks so much, Angie. I appreciate that you went through the different phases of MVI, victim assistance, and helped us to be able to distinguish what's needed in each of the phases and how we can address those needs with evidence-based strategies. So thank you for that. And so one of my favorite parts of the national town halls is that the practical advice. So one strategy or skill that our town hall members are going to impart after all 71 slides. So let's have our presenters bring it home with some practical guidance. So Dr. Reingold.
All right. So I guess my take-home message is that there really is no one way or right way to respond to trauma. Some people may struggle and have greater risk of problems than others, and that our responses is unique and it's complex, and there are many factors that influence how individuals and even communities heal when impacted by mass violence. And also that it's a life journey that evolves over time. So for many communities and peoples, it can be years, and it's learning how not to live life being run by trauma, but how to carry that trauma gently as we live life.
Great. Thank you, Alyssa. Dr. Reingold, brother, Dr. Hansen.
Yeah, I guess maybe the biggest thing I would invite you all to think about is the fact that most people respond, and well, let me take that back. Just kind of reiterating the whole notion that there's not one way or even a right way to respond to trauma, but that the way it is expressed is going to also vary depending upon the age and developmental level of the child. So I think that's a real critical takeaway. And also that for kids, as even adolescents, the role of the caregiver, right? How the caregiver is doing is incredibly important to how a child's doing. And also to keep in mind that a caregiver who may be a first responder, kids are going to be very, very sensitive and attuned and concerned about their caregiver, even if they themselves did not experience that traumatic event. And then, lastly, I would just say again, the whole importance about paying attention to the culture and background of that family.
Thank you, Rochelle. Dr. Moreland Johnson.
I think most importantly is the impact of mass violence doesn't end. So it really lasts from early response all the way through long-term recovery and resilience. And victim needs really will change over time. But even so, it's important to assess those ongoing needs and make sure we're assessing and addressing different stages of recovery. So when other mass violence incidents occur across the country, victims may be faced with trauma cues. They may experience reactions that are similar to those experienced following their own mass violence experience. And we need to provide information and ways to cope with these immediate responses and immediate symptoms, but also those trauma cues that come up. And that's really critical to long-term resilience and recovery.
Thank you so much, Angie. And thanks to all of you for those takeaways, summarizing all that great information you provided. So the National Mass Violence Center is here for you to provide consultations or technical assistance. Please email any inquiries to nmvvrc@musc.edu. So we're going to take some time to go through some questions. We're really, really grateful to each of you who sent questions in. And we want to try our best to address them. We kind of compressed some of them, and let's go ahead and go through them. And this is going to go to Dr. Reingold. How can designated peer support and victim survivor support groups be helpful to mass violence victims to mitigate the impact of trauma across the lifespan?
Peer support is really crucial. As Angie had sort of mentioned, and I mentioned in mine, that social support we know is a buffer for healing and recovery. Therefore, peer support is really important. Peer support helps people feel less isolated, helps people really connect to others and validate experiences. Mass violence is so unique, and just really connecting to others can be helpful. Especially over the course of one's lifespan. So when trauma cues come up, or even just life events come up, they may be positive life events that might come up, but might bring on change cues or trauma cues. And just having that peer support network can really be helpful to encourage people to learn different ways of managing and moving through those difficult times.
Great, thank you. And this is to Alyssa as well, or Angie. So what are some tips to support survivors who may be, quote, stuck in their trauma, or who may be susceptible to trauma cues that bring up negative emotions?
Well, it's sort of a two-part question. So maybe, Angie, I'll just jump in real quick about being stuck in trauma. Maybe you can jump in about trauma cues. So, trauma response and recovery is a process. And I think people just need to have some compassion for themselves and for each other through that process. And I'm going to just lean on some words from actually a therapist that I chatted with yesterday in Uvalde, Texas, and share his analogy that I think was very appropriate for being stuck. So being stuck in trauma is kind of like if you're stood still and you physically are stuck in cement and can't move forward. And how do you physically walk? How do you physically move forward? And it might be not really cement, more like maybe quicksand even. And so the first step is really maybe to just gently wiggle your knees, maybe just gently move, and being okay with the discomfort that you may feel in that gentle, small movements. And then maybe you move your hips and sway your body a little. And again, be uncomfortable with that movement and being okay with that. And maybe celebrate the wins of that movement as you're feeling stuck to the ground. And then maybe you can take small steps. And so it's a small evolution process. And maybe those small steps are taking you where you want to live life, and focusing on that aspect that helps you move forward. And so it's really kind of a life journey and a process. And those might be ways to kind of help imagine or help support somebody in taking those small steps towards how to live a full life while carrying that trauma.
Yeah, I can jump into that. Yeah, I can jump into that second part about the trauma cues and kind of what you can do for yourself. I think a big piece is paying attention to when those symptoms come up. So sometimes they can seem to come out of the blue, especially when it's a trauma cue, but even if not, kind of as someone's moving through their journey or moving through their path, and different things arise that bring about those symptoms, paying attention to those, writing those down, figuring out what works in those situations so that when they do come again, someone can be more prepared for them and know what to do. And then I love that Alyssa said the compassion piece. I think having compassion for yourself, knowing that those symptoms, there's a reason for those. They're tied to something horrible that's happened. So having that compassion for yourself and taking care of yourself, and whether that means, therapy or skills or using your coping skills or things that are equally as important, such as making sure you're getting enough sleep, eating appropriately and drinking enough water and staying away from substances or from things that are harmful to our bodies. Those small things are ways to take care of yourself. And when someone feels stuck, or when they're having those trauma cues, or when these symptoms are just arising as they're going through life, sometimes we forget those simple kind of smaller pieces of taking care of ourselves that play into that whole picture.
Great. Thanks to both of you. Angie, this one's to you.
Okay.
What can we do to best understand and address the needs of community members after an MVI occurs? And how can we tailor support and services to address their needs?
As I said at the end of my presentation, is just that communities do vary. So I think it's kind of a two-prong answer, in that one piece is being aware of the great evidence-based practices and skills that we have. So, the really bad news is when mass violence occurs. I wish that we lived in a world where we didn't have to prepare for this response and to handle this response. But we do know there are some great interventions, some great strategies, and some great tools out there. So having those, but then also knowing that, they do need to be tailored somewhat. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the approach itself needs to be tailored. It's much more around understanding the components of that particular situation and of that community. So knowing the cultural background, knowing the prior traumas that they've experienced, knowing the landscape that they're already dealing with, whether that's around traumas or around already sociodemographic barriers, a lot of different other things that are present in the community. So it's not so much adapting and changing the actual interventions that we're doing, but it's much more about knowing who we're working with and really taking the steps and the time to understand that community so that we can best deliver these skills that we know in a community so that they're best received and that they can utilize them in the best way.
Thanks, Angie. And Rochelle, this one's to you. And I think you've addressed some of this in your presentation, but I'm going to give you a two-part that, see if you can answer quickly as we're running out of time. How are services and supports for children and adolescent MBI victims different from those for adults? And relatedly, how can we help child victims cope after the murder of a parent in an MBI?
Thanks, Michael. These feel like two very, very different questions. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one very quickly. I'd say the biggest difference when we're talking about interventions for kids and adolescents, number one, is recognizing that the needs of kids vary depending on their age. So it's not, here's the treatment for children. There are going to be different approaches that are important for a younger child versus a middle school or an adolescent. And then secondly, that I've said probably multiple times that bears repeating, a huge difference is the importance of including a caregiver, a supportive caregiver in treatment, because they are going to be the person that's going to be with the child and is going to kind of reinforce anything that's taught or, supported within an intervention. And I feel like talking about how to help kids cope after the murder of a parent is not fair to do it in a very quick time. But I guess the biggest thing is to keep in mind the difference between those trauma reminders as well as those loss reminders, because you're going to have both. So the child is going to have images and intrusive thoughts potentially about what happened to their caregiver, particularly if they weren't even there. They're still going to imagine the worst. And then they're also going to be dealing with the grief and loss of that caregiver and what that means for them throughout their entire lives. And then the last thing is, what can we do to make sure that there is someone supportive in a caretaking role that can really help and support that child?
Great. Thank you so much, Rochelle. And thanks again to all who sent in questions, and thanks to all of our panelists for their insights. So here's how you can access resources from the U.S. DOJ Office for Victims of Crime and the National Mass Violence Center. So I want to point out that we're going to have a list of related resources on the website and the recording of this webinar. And we're going to send out an email when those go online. So we are in our 9th National Town Hall, and each presentation has improved because of the valuable input that we receive from attendees just like you. So the National Mass Violence Center listens to your suggestions, and we appreciate that you take the time to let us know what you think about each national town hall. So please take a photo of the QR code on this slide here, and or link to the online REDCap survey. So to let us know what you think about today's national town hall, and if you have any suggestions for topics for future town halls, we'd love to hear them. Our 10th National Town Hall is scheduled for Thursday, May 23rd, and stay tuned for that topic. We thank all of you for joining our 9th National Town Hall and for your interest and commitment to helping victims, survivors, first responders, and communities affected by mass violence. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.